Okay, I think we can get started. So you're very welcome here this evening. My name is Lorraine and I'm in the Institute of Food and Health here in UCD. So we've been running this series of public health, or public lectures, really to give an outreach to some of the nutrition that we're doing here in UCD. So for those of you who don't know, we have a BSc in Human Nutrition and an MSc in Nutrition and Clinical Nutrition and Dietetics here in UCD, and we have many people who work in the area of and do research in the area of human nutrition. So we set up this series to run in 2019 to cover different aspects of nutrition, really with an idea to give an outreach or to give lectures to the general public. So we have flyers outside as well for the 2020 series, so if you're interested in them, please do pick them up. So tonight it is with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague, Aifric O'Sullivan. So Aifric done her BSc in the University of Limerick. She subsequently done her PhD here in UCD and then went to the States and worked for a number of years in the University of California in Davis. So she's back here now as a lecturer in human nutrition, and her research area is focusing on nutrition in early childhood. So tonight she's going to give you what I'm sure is going to be an excellent lecture on aspects of nutrition in early childhood. So I'll hand over to Aifric.
Thanks, Lorraine. Okay, thank you to everybody for being here. Some familiar faces and others that I don't know yet. So my talk today is about nutrition in early childhood health. And in early childhood, I'm kind of defining it as less than 5 years old. So there's a lot to cover from birth to 5 years. And I've broken it down into 3 stages, as you can see here. You'll also notice my lovely model, Robin, who is my 3-year-old niece, and you'll see her cropping up in most slides. So I've broken it into the kind of 3 stages of under 5 nutrition. And there's, as I said, there's an awful lot to cover. There's excellent resources out there that will go into the very kind of the detail of each stage. And you'll see that I use some of those resources throughout my slides, and I've referred to them, and I'll come back to them at the end if anybody is interested in where the information was coming from. But for kind of my talk, I'm going to just give you the headline, what is recommended for each stage. And what I really want to do is to delve into a little bit of the why it's recommended. So I won't spend too much time focusing on what foods should be eaten at what stages. I'll certainly give examples, but I want to kind of go into the why we recommend or why these are the recommendations a little bit more. And as I said, I have links to the resources that I'll be using throughout the talk at the end so that you can kind of access them afterwards. So starting with the first stage, 0 to 6 months, and this is quite an easy one because the recommendation is universal and it's the same recommendation in every country across the world, and that is to exclusively breastfeed for the first 6 months of life. And after that, we introduce complementary foods, and the recommendation is to continue breastfeeding through that kind of weaning phase. We'll talk to the weaning phase in a little bit. So just to start with, well, why do we recommend exclusive breastfeeding? Well, there's a number of different health benefits associated with exclusive breastfeeding. So these are just some of the examples that I've picked out. So the first refers to a reduced risk of overweight and obesity for babies who are exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months of life. The second picture is showing that breastfeeding supports both physical and cognitive development. The third refers to supporting the immune system of the baby, and I'm going to go into this one a little bit deeper again. And then the last I've just noted is that there's also benefits to the mother if they breastfeed. So reduced risk of certain diseases and also a return to pre-pregnancy weight quicker. So just to kind of, as I said, I'm going to select out certain examples as I go through the talk. And for this one, I'm selecting out the lower risk of infections for exclusively breastfed babies being one of the reasons why we recommend exclusive breastfeeding. So this is just one example of a study that shows this. There's several studies that show a reduced risk. And it's coming from a big study that was done in the Netherlands, and it's called the Generation R study. And they had quite a big cohort, so they had about over 5,000 babies. And in the study, they measured breastfeeding. They measured it at 2 months, at 6 months, and at 12 months. So they were measuring it as it was happening, which is an important thing when it comes to research. So they weren't relying on recall. And they divided babies into never being breastfed, less than 3 months breastfed, 3 to 6 months breastfed, and 6+ months breastfed. And they looked at the relationship between the duration of breastfeeding and then lower respiratory tract infections, so things like coughs and colds. And they recorded the amount of lower respiratory tract infections at age 2, 3, and 4 years of age. And then they were looking to see, is the relationship between the amount of breastfeeding or the duration of breastfeeding and the risk of lower respiratory tract infections. And so this table shows that. So what they're doing is they're comparing if a baby was breastfed for less than 3 months, 3 to 6 months, or greater than 6 months, was the risk of lower respiratory tract infections lower? And this figure here, 0.63, shows that if a baby was breastfed for 6 months or more, they had a significantly, so that's just referring to statistical significance, so they had a significantly lower risk of lower respiratory tract infections. So the kind of next question is, well, what is it in breast milk or breastfeeding that kind of has that effect or gives that health benefit? So breast milk is made up of a large part water, but there's also solids. And in those solids, we have our nutrients. So we have our carbohydrate, our protein, our fat, and our micronutrients. And so if we zoom into this part, and that's what you're seeing here in this droplet, we have the carbohydrate, which is the lactose, the lipids, that's the fat component, this HMO component that I'm going to go into a bit more detail of. These are types of sugars that we get in milk. And then the protein component. So I'm going to focus on those two components as I try to explain the lower respiratory tract infection risk. So starting with the protein bit, as part of the protein component in breast milk, we have immunoglobulins and cytokines. And these are two types of proteins that are involved in the immune response. We also have growth factors and hormones that are important in regulating growth and development. With the HMOs, so all of these types of proteins essentially are important in that immune response, I suppose. With the HMOs, these are human milk oligosaccharides, and these are the third most abundant component in breast milk. And these are complex sugars that are specific to breast milk that have very specific functions that again are supporting that immune development. And so the next slide just shows that in a little bit more detail. So here on the left hand side, you can see that this picture of colostrum, which is the milk in the first 3 days after birth, is more dense. There's more of these human milk oligosaccharides. There's higher concentrations in that kind of first milk in the first 3 days. Whereas as the milk matures, there's a little bit less, but they still persist. So what we know about colostrum is that it's a really important fluid and that it's really there as a kind of protective for the baby. So there's a lot of kind of immune related factors in this colostrum, and human milk oligosaccharides are just one of those components. So what do these human milk oligosaccharides do? Number one, they help to feed our gut microbiota. So when I say gut microbiota, I'm talking about those healthy bacteria in our gut. So human milk oligosaccharides are specific to healthy bacterial strains, and they really kind of help those healthy bacteria kind of establish in the gut and grow. So that is the first part. The second part is that they promote the development of the intestine. So they help the intestine to mature in the way that we want it to. And then they also protect against pathogenic infections. So what they do is they act as a decoy to some pathogens that the baby might come into contact with. So instead of adhering to those intestinal cells, the pathogens can adhere to the HMOs, so they're acting as a decoy. So it prevents those pathogens from attaching to intestinal cells. There's also other evidence to show that they help to stimulate the maturing immune cells in the baby's system as well. So these HMOs are a really important component of breast milk that have really strong links to immune defences and immune response. Okay, so that's just one of the reasons why we have that recommendation for exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. Okay, the other part on this slide that I'd like to highlight as well is at the end of the slide we're mentioning that breastfeeding should begin within 1 hour of birth and should be on demand for the baby. So quite regular feeds throughout the day. So the reasons for this not only are to do with giving food to the baby, but also they're got to do with establishing a milk supply. So it's important to start breastfeeding within 1 hour of birth and to feed on demand and frequently, and that helps to both kind of stimulate the milk production and secretion, but also to maintain that supply as the baby is feeding and as the baby is growing. The last point on this slide relates to the vitamin D supplement that's recommended in Ireland. So in Ireland, in addition to our recommendation of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, all babies, whether breastfed or formula fed, should get a vitamin D supplement. So we know that vitamin D is a very important nutrient. It's important for bone development, and there's also research that shows that in later life, low levels of vitamin D are associated with risk of other diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So we know that in Ireland our levels are quite low. We don't get enough from the sun, so we can synthesize vitamin D in our skin when we're exposed to sunlight, and we can also get it from foods, either natural source foods or foods that have been fortified with vitamin D, but generally we don't do great when it comes to vitamin D. And so that's why we have this recommendation for all babies to be supplemented with a 5 microgram supplement of vitamin D daily, and there's special types of vitamin D drops available to give to babies. Okay, before I move on from the 0 to 6 stage, just to mention that I suppose I'm conscious that I haven't talked about infant formula, but the recommendations around infant formula are that if a mother chooses not to breastfeed, then first infant formula is the only other option in terms of a milk feed. And this table I just thought was nice because it takes you through the different types of formulas that are marketed and shows you what age or stage that they are suitable for. So really just highlighting, so breast milk is here top of this table, and then infant formula suitable from birth, so that's first milk. You'll see first milk marketed is the one that is recommended from 0 to 6 months, and also after the introduction of complementary foods from 6 to 12 months. There are some other types of formulas, so for example a hungry baby formula, which is again based on a cow's milk formula, but it has a higher casein, which is one of the proteins which is more difficult for a baby to digest, which some mothers choose, but it's not recommended. The recommended is to stick with the first infant milk. There are other examples, for example there could be specialised formulas, and those would be prescribed from a baby or a family's GP if needed. So the most important thing to note, I suppose, is that if a mother isn't breastfeeding, that it's infant formula that they're using and not, for example, our regular cow's milk, which only becomes a kind of a main milk after 12 months. Okay, so that kind of takes me through, that's just the kind of top line of the 0 to 6 months. After 6 months, we start to introduce complementary foods. So exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months of life. Thereafter, continue to breastfeed in combination with suitably nutritious complementary foods for up to 2 years of age and beyond. So starting with what types of foods are introduced and the different stages for the introduction. So this is the kind of standard approach to weaning or introducing complementary foods. So at 6 months we're introducing the first foods, and they typically have a very kind of a soft pureed texture. so that it's something that the baby can manage. At 6 months, you're introducing that first food, and you're kind of aiming to start with a couple of teaspoons, and you build that up gradually to about 6 teaspoons. And when a baby is able to take about 6 teaspoons, you're then moving on to maybe an additional feed that day. So you slowly kind of introduce and build up. And the types of foods that you might be starting with there would be things like an iron fortified baby cereal or baby rice, or for example, like the picture shows, it's a pureed carrot. And the recommendation with that is to introduce kind of one food, like leaves about a day or two between each food, so that you can monitor if the baby is having a reaction to that particular food. So it's slowly, gradually building up as you go along. Once you've kind of had a couple of weeks of introducing that first food, you can start to move on to the next phase, which is kind of introducing a more mashed or lumpy texture. At this stage, the baby is probably taking 2 to 4 tablespoons per feed or per meal, and you'd be building up to 3 meals and possibly 2 snacks in between those meals during that stage. By this stage now, babies have probably been introduced to a range of different foods, and they're eating more kind of combination meals. The last kind of stage is the finger food stage. I should probably say that in this kind of 6 to 9 month period, you can also be introducing those softer finger foods. So things like soft pasta shapes or soft bread or things like that, in addition to the kind of mashed textured foods. In the last stage then, kind of 9 to 12 months is the kind of typical age of the child when they reach the finger food stage. And in this stage, you're looking at kind of 4 to 6 tablespoons per meal. And at this stage also, the baby or the child at this stage is consuming 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks per day. And again, as you get closer to the 12 months, the baby is going to be eating more of the kind of family type foods. There's less kind of modifying that's needed by the time the baby is kind of 9 months or so. Couple of things just to mention as we go through here. Iron containing foods become one of the really important things to try to get into a baby's diet, and I'm going to touch on that in a minute. So introducing, say, things like minced red meat as part of one of the mashed dishes, for example. Including fish in the baby's diet is another important one. And then 2 things that I'd often get questions about would be what about introducing gluten, and what about introducing nuts at this stage? And the recommendation is to introduce those early on in the weaning process. And I suppose important particularly if you're concerned about allergies, is that you're monitoring the intake of, say, if it's peanut butter that you're introducing, and also giving it regularly thereafter. So at regular intervals once it's been introduced. So there's no reason why you would avoid introducing those kind of typical allergenic foods early on in the weaning process. The last kind of thing to mention in relation to this kind of weaning stage is the movement or the change to using a cup or a beaker. So babies at 6 months onwards can start to use a cup or a beaker. They typically start with a cup or beaker that has some sort of a spout on it. The recommendation is that it's not a valved spout, so that it's free flowing. And then by the time they get to 12 months or a year, they're moving on to drinking out of the beaker without that spout on it, so without a lid or a spout, and drinking straight from the beaker or the cup. Okay, so the kind of 2 questions I'm going to kind of look into a bit more here is, well, why do we say 6 months, and what are the important nutrients at this stage? And so firstly, at 6 months, babies are developmentally ready for complementary foods. So they reach a stage where they're kind of, the reflexes associated with a milk only diet, so the sucking reflex and the rooting reflex, start to disappear, so after about 4 to 5 months. At the same time, babies are starting to kind of sit supported, they have better head control, they're able to kind of coordinate their hands to their mouth, they're able to accept a spoon if you hand it to them. So these are all kind of signs that a baby is ready to be introduced to complementary foods, and they tend to happen around 6 months of age. The other important point then from the kind of development, the neurological and kind of fine and gross motor skill development perspective, is that it is important to move through those stages that I described in the previous slide, as they also help to move the baby along those stages. So, for example, meal times help to develop hand-eye coordination. Babies learn to be able to move the food around their mouth, be able to chew, then be able to swallow. So these are all kind of important developmental stages. The other important thing is that mealtime becomes a time where they interact with you. And so that's kind of really important part of their kind of own psychological and social development, as well as the kind of fine and gross motor skills that are developing at the same time. Okay, the other reason then is that at 6 months, milk only is not enough to meet the requirements of the baby. And I've used an example of iron. That's one of the critical nutrients at this stage. So babies are born with a supply or a store of iron. And at about 6 months, those stores are beginning to become depleted. And it's also a time where they need more iron. They're very active. They're growing rapidly. They're learning a lot. They're developing. And so iron requirements are high relative to the size of them. And so we need to start introducing iron or food sources that contain iron as part of those complementary foods. So on the right hand side, there's just some pictures of a couple of examples of food sources. And these would be things that you'd be looking to introduce to a baby. So red meat, for example, is a really good source of iron for anybody. Eggs are another source, and then kind of the dark green leafy vegetables, things like broccoli and spinach, are also good sources. Beans and legumes are also good sources of iron. So it's important that we do introduce those types of foods early on in the weaning process. As I said as well, a lot of the baby cereals will be fortified with iron, so will be another source of iron in a child's diet. Okay. Just on the kind of weaning, one of the kind of questions that I would often get asked, so I suppose you'll see as I go through this talk that there's a couple of kind of things I've added in, which are usually questions that I'd get asked. So one is around baby-led weaning. So what I've described to you is the kind of traditional or standard approach to weaning, where you start with a pureed food and you develop up to the kind of soft finger foods, and then finally to the finger foods and the full family meals. Baby-led weaning is an approach where kind of foods are offered, usually finger foods are offered at the very start of the weaning period. And I suppose one of the concerns from a public health perspective is babies can be offered foods that might be choking risks and need to be monitored from that kind of perspective. And then there's also concerns that they may or may not get enough of the critical nutrients that we know they need at that stage. So iron being one example, calcium, vitamin D, zinc being other examples. And to be honest, there isn't a whole lot of research done comparing the kind of traditional approach to weaning to baby-led weaning. There's a couple of studies that have come out just in the last couple of years, really. And this is just one example. It's a study that was published only very recently in 2019. And it was a study done in the UK. And while it's a relatively small sample size, so there was 88 babies in the kind of traditional or standard weaning approach group. There was 46 babies in the baby-led weaning. It's actually one of the biggest studies that I've seen that has been published with data comparing the two groups. So in this study, they recruited babies and mothers or parents, and they did a food frequency questionnaire and a 24-hour dietary recall to look at what the babies were getting in terms of complementary foods. And they compared different types of food groups, and then they compared different nutrients between the two groups. So I'm just going to focus on the nutrients. And so overall, there wasn't major differences between the two groups. I suppose that was the first thing. Energy, carbohydrate, protein, and free sugars, which are essentially added sugars to foods, were the same between the two groups. In the standard weaning, they had higher iron intakes and higher zinc intakes from milk foods, okay? And in the baby-led weaning group, they had a higher fat intake and a higher sodium or salt intake. Okay, so there were quite minor differences. Overall, total iron from milk sources and food sources were actually not significantly different. It was just the iron and zinc from milk, but those would be probably the two nutrients that most people would be concerned about in the baby-led weaning approach. So that's just kind of a quick snapshot look at the baby-led weaning. Okay, so that takes us through 6 to 12 months, and now we're into the preschool years, so kind of aged 1 to 4. Okay, so firstly, I suppose I want to highlight in Ireland we have healthy eating guidelines in the form of a food pyramid, and they were recently updated. But of note, they start at age 5 and they go up to old age. We don't have yet, and I believe they're on the way, we don't yet have the preschool kind of food pyramid booklet like this. But we do have just a slightly older one that was geared towards preschool services, and there's a range of other resources also available for the preschool age, and again I'll note them to you at the end of the talk. But what we're aiming for in these kind of preschool years are 3 balanced meals a day, toddler-sized portions, and we'll look at portion sizes a little bit, and then 2 to 3 nutritious snacks in between those meals. And the main food groups that we want to focus on in the preschool years are fruit and vegetables, starchy carbohydrates, milk, cheese and yogurt, fish, egg, meats, beans and others. So we're going to look kind of at what's a typical portion size and what we should be aiming for kind of for each of these types of food groups. So starting with fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables should be offered at each meal and as parts of snacks. So I suppose this is probably the group that we want to target most. It's important to offer different types because we know that different types of fruits and vegetables are rich in different types of micronutrients, so we want to get a combination of all of them. And we want to avoid added sugar in fruits and vegetables where possible. And so the plates up here are giving examples of a suitable portion for a child aged 3 to 4. So about 40 grams of broccoli, about 40 grams of blueberries would be considered a typical portion size for fruits or vegetables. With the carbohydrates group, we're aiming for about a third of food offered at each meal would be from the carbohydrates group. And the carbohydrates group is anything from bread to pasta to rice to the starchy vegetables like potatoes or sweet potatoes. Recommendations around this food group are to choose whole grain where possible, so going with whole grain or brown rice, pasta and bread where possible, and again looking for no added sugar varieties, and that's particularly when you're looking at breakfast cereals, for example, would be one where there could be added sugars, so trying to go for the no added sugar varieties there. And again, the portion sizes here, the left hand picture is wholemeal bread and it's about half a bread roll or 25 grams. That's the equivalent of about 1 slice of a sliced pan bread. And then the other is mashed sweet potatoes, which is about 80 grams. The next food group is the milk, cheese and yogurt or alternatives group. These milk, cheese, yogurt should be offered at 3 meals or as snacks. Usually I would recommend that you're aiming for full fat milk when offering milk to preschool children, and full fat milk can be the main milk drink after 1 year of age. Again, you're looking at portion sizes here for yogurt on the left and for cheddar cheese on the right. For yogurt, about 50 grams is one portion, and cheddar cheese about 15 grams is a toddler sized portion. I'm going to also come back to the milk in particular on the next slide. Again, one of those questions that I often get asked. The last group then is the meat, fish, egg and other, and I would include beans, legumes in here. It was just the amount of space I had to write. So the examples in terms of portion sizes I have here is beef on the left, that's 40 grams, and salmon on the right, which is also 40 grams. This food group should be offered at least 2 meals or snacks, and this one is one of the kind of rich sources of some of the critical nutrients, so iron being one example, or the essential fatty acids that we get in, for example, oily fish like salmon would be another good example. Okay, so going back to the milks from 1 to 4 years, so as I said, cow's milk, full fat cow's milk can be the main milk drink from 1 year onwards, so infant formulas are not needed from then on. But I get asked questions about what about the alternative milks. So things like oat milk, in the yellow, the pink is soya, the green is hemp, the purple colour is coconut, and the last column, the almond, is the orange. So there's just a couple of things. These can be offered, but there's just important things to note relative to cow's milk. So energy is the first thing. So cow's milk contains more energy per volume, and I'll show you a picture that kind of looks at that in a bit more detail. The other is around some of the vitamins and minerals or micronutrients. So all of the milks that I'm showing or comparing it to are all fortified versions, so that's good in that they're fortified with a lot of the nutrients that we'd be hoping they'd be fortified with. Calcium being the example, so they're all fortified with pretty much the same amount of calcium, which is 120 milligrams. So in comparison though, if we look at some of the other ones, for example iodine, there is about 31 micrograms of iodine in cow's milk compared to between 6 and 13 micrograms in some of the other milks. So that would be one where you might look and say, well, it's not fortified maybe to the same amount as you would get from cow's milk. So it's just kind of an important thing to note. In relation to the energy, as I said already, so for a smaller amount of milk, you're getting the same energy as you would from a larger amount of some of the other milk. So almond milk being the least energy dense. And I suppose why that's important, particularly in the younger years, so for a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, when they're still relatively small, their stomach is still small, and so if they're drinking a lot of alternative milks, not getting the same amount of energy, if that is a key source of energy in their diet, it's just to be conscious of it, I suppose. Okay, so what does that look like in practice then? This is just an example of a kind of a one-day menu for a 3-year-old child. So starting off with breakfast, it's porridge, some blueberries and a slice of toast and a glass of water. Lunch being something like a spaghetti bolognese, and dinner here being an omelette, I think, with some potato salad and some cucumber. On top of that, and it is really important that children do need kind of extra snacks throughout the day. I know we're all probably trying to avoid eating extra snacks, but for kids with small stomachs who are usually very active, we do need those snacks in between. And the examples of snacks here, milk and some chopped peppers, peanut butter on oat cakes and some orange segments I've included there to kind of start to introduce things like the peanut butter being important kind of early in childhood. And then the last one is some yogurt, banana, and again some blueberries on the side. So it's just an example of what that kind of offering fruits and vegetables with each meal, getting in your dairy, getting in your meat, getting in your carbohydrates, as per the recommendations. So why are these the recommendations? I suppose the other thing I wanted to note on this slide is highlighting, the variety across the day and very nutrient rich, and that's critical. The nutrient rich bit is because children, for their size, have quite high micronutrient requirements compared to adults. Okay, so essentially children are not just small adults. They're growing, they're developing, and they're learning all the time, and so that drives demand for micronutrients. And so if demands for micronutrients are high, yet their kind of energy intake is a little bit lower compared to ours, then the foods that they're eating have to be really nutrient dense, I suppose. So on the right hand side, this is just taken from some UK data, and it's comparing kind of a preschool child in the red to an older child and to an adult female in this dark blue. Okay, so for an adult female, this is the amount of the nutrient they should be getting, and if you compare a child's requirements to an adult, you see that for zinc, for example, it's almost 4 times relative to size. I suppose that's important to mention as well. Vitamin A, again, about 3 times, calcium just over twice, and then iron about 1.5 times, or just under 1.5 times the amount that an adult needs relative. So these are all critical nutrients, and that is why we need to have that kind of variety in children's diets, to make sure that they're meeting the range of nutrients that they need. And then I suppose just to finish off, this is again looking at why variety and getting micronutrients is important, and it's just one example from research, but it's looking at the link between diet quality and cognition, and it measures cognition in school performance. So again, this is one of the big infant cohorts that exist around the world, and this study is in Australia. It's the RAIN study, and they had nearly 2,300 children involved in the study, and they measured diet at age 1, 2 and 3, and they also had scores from maths, reading, writing and spelling tests at a later stage, so at age 10 and 12. And they wanted to know, is there a relationship between a healthy diet in the younger years and that kind of performance in school in kind of older childhood? And so they were able to show that a higher diet quality at age 1 resulted in higher scores for maths, reading, writing and spelling at both ages, so at age 10 and at age 12. And when they looked kind of at the individual food groups, children with higher intakes of fruits and vegetables and higher intakes of dairy foods scored better across all of these measures as well at age 10 and at age 12. So just highlighting the importance of those kind of early years and healthy eating in kind of the effect that it can have across kind of childhood and then again even into adulthood. So the take-home messages are firstly, I suppose, in terms of the recommendations. The recommendation is exclusive breastfeeding to 6 months, followed by the introduction of appropriate complementary foods, and then moving to a very healthy, varied, nutrient-rich diet in preschool years. Nutrition, I suppose, in early childhood lays the foundation for lifelong health, and I hope that I've given you some examples to prove that, I suppose. The other thing to note though, and it's as important, is that it not only lays the foundation for lifelong health in terms of the health effects that it has, but it also lays the foundation for healthy eating behaviours and healthy lifestyle in general. So typically children who start with a healthy diet in preschool years will carry or continue to have more healthy diets as childhood continues and into adulthood. So the research shows us that a healthy diet early on is associated with a healthy diet later on, as well as the additional health benefits that we know. So just to mention some of those resources that I want to point you to. So the Food Safety Authority of Ireland has a really good information booklet on best practice for infant feeding. And then we have this updated version which is available on the safefood.eu webpage called Feeding Your Baby, Introducing Family Meals. So that's more focused on the complementary feeding phase. In this one you'll get information on the kind of pregnancy and breastfeeding as well as the complementary. The other website which I find excellent is firststepsnutrition.org. It's a UK website, and they have got really nice resources looking at portion sizes, and just this one is really good. It's kind of very simple snack ideas for preschool years, and they also have kind of a recipe one that looks at kind of lunches and dinners for the same age. So I really recommend going to the firststepsnutrition.org. They also have other resources around breastfeeding and infant milks that are available in the UK and in Ireland. So a really good resource if you are looking for more information on any of the things that I described today. So that's it, just to say thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm very conscious that I was taking just bits and pieces from across the 5 years. So if there's anything in particular that you want any more information on, please do ask, and I'll try to answer at least.